Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amor de Soi Wellness. And Donovan Jensen is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are talking about how to be a better friend. Let's talk about it. So, Donovan, what are your initial thoughts when it comes to becoming a better friend?
Yes, I think probably where we'll end up focusing, or at least the first thing that comes to my mind is, there are certain things you can do to kind of be like a good person or a nice person or whatever else. And I think being a good or a better friend is just like a flavor of that. So in the same way as when you're like communicating versus text versus talking, like how do you be a better friend versus a better spouse? Like there's going to be overlap in a lot of these different things, and then probably a couple things that are specific to those sorts of relationships. I can start rattling off a bunch of random stuff about how to like have better relationships, but I'd be curious about your thoughts first.
Yeah, my initial thoughts are I think there is going to be a lot of overlap between being a better friend and being a better like significant other or partner. But there will probably be difference that we'll go over. And it's to also comment on that, it's not to say that you're a bad friend now or anything like that, or maybe you are. How do we repair those relationships and how do we enhance those relationships and build and continue to sustain relationships? That's I think going to be something we'll want to touch on too.
Well, here's the place that I would like to start because I feel like I'm getting more and more mileage out of this. But like, let's start around kind of what makes a bad friend or things that bad friends do. Just because I feel like when we have negative examples, at least for me, it really helps me understand like where all the space is to improve. Right. So I'd be curious in your mind, like what are some of the things bad friends do, or what sort of constitutes that sort of relationship?
I think the initial thoughts that come to my mind for a bad friend is someone that just doesn't like have care and consideration of another person when it comes to certain things, that they're only thinking about themselves and their interest and not really kind of being like, how does this affect this other person? How does this affect my friend? Are they going to be upset? Like more self-interested or just not like present to the impact of their actions to others, I think can be something to consider.
Yeah, that actually lines up exactly with what I was thinking, which is like, okay, what are the times that I felt like someone has been a bad friend or a good friend has had an instance of being a bad friend?
Right.
And it is pretty much, like you said, times where the person is solely focused on themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I will add that they chose not to communicate or were so self-absorbed that they didn't think to communicate to sort of, like you were saying, understand the impact. The story that comes top of mind to me is I was visiting a friend one time, and we were both single at the time. We went out to the bars. He went home with someone relatively early, but I was there visiting, so that was the place that I had to stay.
Oh, good.
So, and I had been drinking, so my car was there, but like not proper for me to be driving.
Right.
Anyway, when I got back to his place, like he didn't answer his phone, didn't answer the door, didn't answer like anything. So I ended up sleeping in my car overnight.
Oh no.
And like and that's partially my fault for getting that drunk and et cetera, et cetera. There were other options. But to me, that was an instance of just like, and drinking does not help, but being so focused in on something else to not recognize sort of the impact that it would have on your friend. And I'm sure I have had examples, I don't know them off the top of my head because they didn't emotionally impact me as much, but where I have been a bad friend, that's just the one that comes to mind for me. And it's all around like, the considerations of the context for me, which is like, if I lived there and I could just go home, like totally cool. You don't need to think about what's going on for the other person at all or whatever else. But anyway, I just wanted to highlight like kind of how that's come to life for me, and sort of an example of like when you're not paying attention to sort of how your actions impact your friends.
Yeah, definitely. Although I do want to like comment on how, you know, that it's okay to have be self-interested and like especially if you're constantly like giving to others and you have a hard time saying no to friends, then potentially you need to set those boundaries and you need to like be self-interested in those moments because it's like really harming your health or your well-being. That's a different instance. But in that case, it's like still be aware of the impact if like someone's like, hey, can you help me move? Which I have as friends to help me move. Some take me on it, some don't. And sometimes if I'm asked if I can help them move, I'm like, oh, I got another thing. I don't really want to. Depends on like the degree of friendship I do. It's like my willingness to be able to help someone move. But if I'm like, oh, well, I'm dealing with like back pain or something else or I just like I have like exams or something important to study for, then yeah, it makes sense that you can't always help out in every scenario. But it's just like, is it a reoccurring theme? That might be something to look out for versus like, yeah, I never helped out my friends and I never like consider it. Or even if it's like, I want to help, but I can't for whatever reason to help my own well-being, then, still you can have a conversation and dialogue around it. So it doesn't feel like they're being ignored and that you don't care. I think that's the piece is like the care piece is like, is there still care even if you are not able to help?
Yeah, I think the balance makes a big difference, right? Like I have been in relationships, like I've had friends
Mm-hmm.
where they have asked me for a lot of things,
Yeah,
and then when I need help with something, are unwilling to help.
right.
And that's like a huge red flag. And obviously, it doesn't need to be like, oh, I've kept a tally of every single time I've helped you.
Right.
And like, I'm up to
Exactly.
35. You've only helped me 14. Like
Yeah.
that's a little bit excessive, but I feel like you can kind of get a gut feel for some of these things over time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think that just goes right back in line with sort of thinking about how what you're doing is impacting the other person.
Mm-hmm.
So, if it's like this pattern and this person's always getting themselves in trouble and you're always bailing them out and whatever else, like
Right.
them asking you for help all the time with for their own problems or whatever else or things
Yeah.
that they could figure out is
Mm-hmm.
actually kind of them being a bad friend. Like
Yeah.
if you're unable to help or
Mm-hmm.
you just feel like it's completely unbalanced or in some situations if you don't want to, right?
Yeah.
Like that doesn't necessarily mean you're being a bad friend. Like the whole
Right.
uh context and the overall relationship and both sides of it make a big difference for that. But you're 100% right where like
Yeah.
people can get into a position where they're getting like stepped on and saying yes to everything and just like
Right.
agreeing to help on all these things and not
Yeah.
necessarily getting an equivalent back.
Right. Yeah. How balanced is it? Because it's like, yeah, on occasion, it's like there's going to give in any type of relationship, friendship or romantic relationship, there's going to be a give and take. And it's not necessarily healthy to keep tally or score. But, if it's like always one-sided, that's kind of like a red flag to some areas. And thinking about, like, I just remembered a story I read on Reddit about like some like two girls living together who were sort of friends, but one of them like had a cat or something or a dog or something like that, and the other roommate didn't want that animal, but whenever this one person with the pet would leave for trips, she would ask the roommate and friend to watch the dog or cat or whatever animal, I forget. But every time she would just like extend her leave and never come back on the day that she said she would. And so she always like pushed it back. So that was like really taking advantage. And so it's like putting that friend in a predicament of like, hey, I have other plans, and you're kind of like not even being considerate of like by not showing up at times. So like she got so fed up because it's happened so many times that she like at one point she was going to go home for the holidays to visit her family. She was like, I can't watch this dog. And so she just put it in a like a doggy daycare or something, and was like, this is where the dog is, or something like that. And she basically was like ignoring her text, ignoring. She's like, this is what I'm gonna do, ignore. And then she finally did it, and then she like blew up her phone to be like, how dare you have no right to do that with my pet. So a situation like that where someone's constantly taking advantage of the other, or not being considerate of how like their actions, it's like, oh yeah, I want an extended vacation and I want free doggy daycare, is really, you got to look out for that for sure.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned it, but it goes back to how important the communication side of things is too,
Right.
because you can have all forms of it, which is to say that, like, let's say that the person did that vacation once and then extended it and then came back and genuinely had no clue, just wasn't paying attention to the fact that it like put the other person out. They're just like, oh, it's like a couple more days of like filling up the food dish. Like, it's not
Yeah.
crazy,
Right.
Mm-hmm. But so on that person's side, they may not have noticed, and like maybe this happened, maybe it didn't, but the other person could have said something like, hey, like I like I agreed to help for this many days, like,
right,
you're really putting me out. On the flip side, like, if you wanted to be more considerate, if you're leaving on something like that, saying before you leave, or talking about before you leave, like, hey, here's the days I have planned. I might want to stay a few extra days. Like, is that going to be a problem? Is that going to be, like,
right, yeah, have a conversation about that.
yeah. And the more you can open up sort of that dialogue around stuff that might be something that you might think is small, might actually be a huge pain for the other person.
Right.
So even if it seems kind of like redundant, just kind of double checking some of those things can make a lot of headway. Because I've had times on both sides of things where I'm doing something that somebody else is driving them nuts, like my friends, that they absolutely hate, and I have no idea. And I haven't considered the way it was impacting them, because my brain just processes information so differently that it was just like, of course this is not a problem. Like,
Yeah.
I would just never think to ask that like this was a problem.
Yeah.
And so only through them telling me that I have a chance to change something. And I think in friendships you have a lot more space.
Yeah.
Assuming they're like decent friendships, but a lot more space to sort of navigate and negotiate. Whereas, like, if you have a roommate that's a complete stranger you've never talked to before, and you ask them to, like, hey, could you only cook after 9 p.m. or something random, like, those kinds of requests are just gonna be like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, what is this?
Yeah. No, definitely. And it goes to say, sometimes we are unaware of like how our actions are impacting our friends. And it's like, but if there's open communication, and you're willing to make those adjustments if it's within reason, then yeah. But then if it's like a repeated offense and you've had the conversation and you just ignore like the feedback, and you decided to just like ignore it completely, then that's being a bad friend, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. Because it's just like all relationships, a negotiation of sorts, and you can't effectively navigate that negotiation without both sides feeling like they've been represented and had a chance to get their sort of ideas and whatnot on the table.
Yeah. I think
here's another. Oh, go ahead.
I was just thinking of like, I mean, this kind of ties into what we've been talking about, but the big key word that kind of pops into my brain of a bad friend is like someone who doesn't maintain the trust, or doesn't continue to build the trust, or constantly breaks the trust. And yeah, if you say one thing and then you keep going back on your word, then that breaks the trust, and that's gonna like damage the relationship. And if it's like, one time, you might get a pass, it still like hurts the relationship. But if it's a consistent thing, then that's going to consistently damage the relationship and potentially even end it, because sometimes it's not worth it if you feel like you can't trust your friends.
Yeah, I agree. That's a huge point. Like, being able to trust the people you're close to makes such a big difference. And there's sort of there's some nuance around, because I feel like some people lie to their friends because they don't want to hurt their feelings. But there's a difference between like being honest and being hurtful, right? There's like a tactful way that you can tell people things
Right.
that even though it may still not be easy to hear, or it
Mhm.
might not be exactly what they want to hear,
Right.
you can still frame it in a way that doesn't like
It's like
hurt.
really
Yeah.
being a dick. Just made me
Yeah.
think of I'm watching like, and I mentioned this before, I'm watching like Married with First Sight, the Philadelphia season, and the husband like told his wife when they first kissed that it made him feel dead inside and repulsed. It's like, that's a little extreme and very hurtful versus saying something like, yeah, speak your truth. It could be like a little less like intense, like, okay, I'm not feeling the chemistry. It's a lot
Yeah.
different than like,
Yeah.
I am completely repulsed and I feel dead inside. I'm just like, it's like, yeah, be honest, but don't be an asshole.
I think that's a great example, right? Because that is effectively the same message delivered in two sets of wording, one of which
Yeah,
is very likely to cause a lot of hurt.
yeah,
Like, and one that's likely to just land. I mean, it's still going to hurt. It's still going to hurt, but
yeah. It's
not
still gonna
as
hurt.
much. It's not
Yeah,
nearly as damaging. So,
right.
I think that's an important thing for people to like think about and focus on as they develop friendships and work on stuff. Because I have had, again, I've been on both sides of it, but I've had instances where like the truth gets sort of stretched
Mhm.
or just gets turned into a straight up lie
Yeah.
when it's not helpful to the person. Like they trust you, like when
Mhm.
somebody starts dating somebody and they're like, what do you think of this person? You're like, I love them. And then turn around and tell everyone else like they're crazy and they're the worst and I hate them.
Right. Yeah.
Like they're sort of relying on you to be able to give accurate and helpful information.
Right.
So just that, and this is helpful for basically all kinds of communication and relationships and stuff, but finding ways to maintain the message, but in a way that is like just softer or more graceful, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, you can get a lot of mileage out of just because then you don't speak in a way that makes the other person
Mhm.
feel attacked and emotional.
Right.
Because once you get into that sort of pattern, things tend to escalate and you don't really make progress. Like some people, sometimes you'll hear people like say like, "Oh, I'd like, but I need to say how it is,"
Mhm.
and it's like, yeah, there's multiple ways to say pretty
Yeah.
much anything,
Right.
and some of them are more or less
Mhm.
agreeable. Like you can be a
Yeah.
lot more of an asshole for no reason.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think again, it kind of circles back around to like, are you coming from a place of care and concern? Like, let's say your friend is dating or married to someone that you really don't like. You don't like how they treat your friend. You don't think that person's good for your friend. It's like, how do you approach that difficult situation? Because you want to be a supportive friend, but you also don't want them to get hurt. So if you come from a place of care, maybe something like, I'm just kind of spitballing off the top of my head, like, hey, friend, I want to support you in your relationship, and I really love and care about you, but I have like some concerns about like how he's treating you, and I don't know. It's like maybe I don't know the full story. Please share, but I'm just kind of concerned, and I don't want you to get hurt. So maybe something subtle like versus like he's such a dick, you should dump his ass kind of like thing, giving that person like a little space to kind of consider it and give them the freedom to ultimately make their choice whether they stay with that person or not. But being honest of don't be like, yeah, I love him, he's amazing and an amazing partner, when in reality you don't really feel like that.
Yeah, I feel like the way you frame things too can communicate different things in terms of like, okay, if you say, "Oh, like this guy's an asshole, you need to leave him,"
Yeah.
that almost gives the other person no space whatsoever to assert their independence and like
Right.
they're like who they are. It's basically like saying like I'm right, you need to do what I say because I'm right.
Yeah.
When you communicate in those softer ways of like, hey,
Mhm.
I'm concerned about like some of the patterns I'm seeing in this relationship, or like I'm concerned about the way I'm seeing you being treated. Like that doesn't seem right to me.
Right.
You open up so much more space in the conversation to
Mhm.
like let them share their experience, be an active participant, be like um able to sort of think through things themselves instead of you just being like, I'm right, like
Yeah.
leave this person.
Right. And
And
also when you do that, when you're in this, oh, he's an asshole, you should just dump his ass kind of a thing, it kind of makes them, probably the person with the quote unquote asshole, like feel like they're bad or they're wrong or they're stupid for being that person. And so that kind of like puts people on the defense, I think.
yeah, you're implicitly saying that like
Yeah.
there's something wrong
Bad
with them,
choices.
or they've
You make
made a
bad
bad
choices.
choice, or they're
Yeah.
dumb, or something like that.
Yeah.
And we're honed in on this sort of relationship piece, but it's applies to all kinds of communication that you can have between friends, and actually broader than that. But yeah, I've seen plenty of times where friends are basically telling each other what to do, as opposed to like supporting each other and trying to open up the conversation and help them come to find a better solution.
Yeah. Yeah. And that actually makes me think of another important point, kind of feeding off of that, of just like how to be a better friend is to recognize when your friend is specifically asking for advice versus you just giving advice without it being like wanted or asked for, versus like being someone who just is like, yeah, there might be instances where I do want advice from someone who has more experience with a particular thing, but there's also instances where I definitely not in a advice receiving mood, especially if I'm maybe emotionally distraught or something. I might not just be in a mental emotional space for that, and I just need someone to listen to me, not give me advice, because then that makes me more upset. So it's just like, I think being a good friend is to recognize, like, let's start default to just being a space to listen and to hear. And then, if you do feel like an urge to give some advice, before you do it, ask them where they are at receiving it. If they're not in a space to receive it, then maybe like keep your mouth shut or hold off until when they're feeling better.
Yeah, this may not be generalizable, but in a lot of my friendships, I feel like when I check in with someone, which is another thing I should add to the list of things that I think make a good friend, is like occasionally checking on people and seeing how they're doing.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, in the process of just sort of asking, like, hey, what's going on? How are you doing? What's new? If someone's wrestling with someone and they want advice, those things will just sort of like tumble out as I'm asking questions, just to like, hey, what's going on? Like, oh, cool. How's that? Oh, yeah. How's that going? Like, how did that develop? Those sorts of questions. Then these other pieces sort of naturally show up where it's like, and I've been trying to decide between this and this. I don't really know, like, as opposed to, as soon as they say something, try to like, oh, that's stupid. Well, don't do that. Like, oh
Right.
yeah, you don't want that job. That's why.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Any other ways that you feel like a person can be a better friend to others?
So I'll follow up on what I mentioned around like
Yeah.
checking up on your friends,
Oh,
right?
that's important.
As I've become an adult and gotten more responsibilities, and my friends have become geographically distributed,
Right. Yeah.
I just don't have the same number of instances to check in on what's going on and whatnot. So being a little bit more mindful around just checking in, just to see how people are doing, and like the relationships that had a strong basis to begin with, I feel like it's pretty easy to provide enough space for them to open up emotionally. And like you said, sometimes there's space for advice, sometimes it's just like listening and just
Yeah.
hanging out. Sometimes people are like excited about stuff and they just want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And then looking from the opposite perspective as to what I appreciate, like I definitely appreciate when somebody checks in and is like, "How are things going? What's new?" Like, and I'm able to sort of just like speak out my experience and sort of have an outlet to share with people. So, um, other people may have a different experience because their friends might be a little closer than some of mine are, but I found that just making sure to make space every once in a while to check in on everyone keeps the friendship alive, because I'm like able to catch up on what's going on with them.
Yeah.
But it also makes it feel meaningful, as opposed to just waiting until like, hey, you want to go on vacation together, or like, some sort of more task oriented or like outcome oriented sort of communication.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'm curious though on like, the reaching out part, because I've had it both ways, and I have a lot of friendships, and some I'm like terrible at maintaining, like reaching out because I get caught up in life and I forget. It's just like it's been a while, but whenever we do get connected, it's like we just pick up where we left off last. But I've heard kind of both ways that some people, want there to be equal initiation of the connection from both sides. And sometimes it's more one-sided than the other. And I know for some of my friendships, maybe they feel like they're the one initiating more than I am. But for other friendships, I'm like probably the one that's constantly initiating more. And then there's the ones in between where it's like pretty 50-50 or so. So how do you feel about that? It's like, is it bad if you're always the one initiating? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is the kind of thing that gets way overthought. So as long as the relationship as a whole feels genuine,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that detail matters.
Yeah.
I think people get busy. I think people aren't necessarily trying to make time for it. I think stuff just happens. Like I have a really good friend. We lived in the same city or like within 10 miles of each other for 2 years.
Yeah.
Never talked or hung out once for no reason, and then just started hanging out and talking all the time again. And like, it wasn't I don't remember who reached out to who. I don't remember any, but like the who was initiating the contact had very little to do with the quality of the relationship, at least in my mind, in terms of like, it wasn't like, oh, I need to wait for him to do it, or he was like, oh, I have to wait for Donovan to reach out to me. Like it was just sort of this, we're both just living our lives and like, for whatever reason, didn't think about it.
Right.
So the only time I think that it could be a problem is if you're reaching out all the time and only you, or if it's 100% one way and one person doesn't seem interested. That's the time that I'm like, okay, this is probably not awesome. Like, because I've definitely had times where again, both sides of it, right? Where like I'm getting texts from someone like every week, and I'm just like, you're like a twice a year friend. Like I can't, like this is not gonna work for me. And the other way around, where I've like, invited someone to a bunch of different things and they just didn't seem that interested. So, and I still don't know that that's even a huge problem as much as it is sort of demoralizing, right? Like,
right. I wouldn't, like, after a certain point, I'd want to like, not try so hard.
Unless the person is like actively being sort of like rude or creepy or aggressive, like even the stuff that I don't intend to go to, I still appreciate sort of like the invites or the check-in.
Oh, totally.
Or whatever else. So I think it's only a problem if it's like completely one-sided and someone seems uncomfortable.
Right. Or disinterested. Yeah, I do realize that, even if I call my friend like once every couple years, or they call me once every couple years, I think generally we're just caught up in life. It's not like we're hurt that, oh, how dare you you haven't talked to me in a year or anything like that. It's just like we're interested in catching up and hearing about each other's life. And it's like, okay, if we can't talk at that moment, we'll catch each other at some point. But there's like interest in engaging with each other to some degree, versus like if I keep calling and they're like keep sending me to voicemail and never returning my calls or texts and just being like, I'm busy and not interested, then I don't think that's a friendship I'd want to maintain.
Or adding on to that, I have another example of like, I had a friend that I used to talk to just about every week.
Yeah.
Give or take. And now we talk every couple months or so. And the thing that changed is we both are in relationships now. Like
makes a difference.
Committed relationships. And like, there's just not as many moments or instances of me just like sitting there twiddling my thumbs and being like, oh, I should call this guy. It just doesn't come up as much. So I have to be more mindful and more present around like, or actually straight up just schedule like, okay, this is what I'm going to call my friend, so I don't just forget over and over and over again. But again, it doesn't have anything to do with like I got busier. It doesn't mean that I'm like, this guy sucks now. Like,
I don't want to be your friend.
I don't want to hear about what's going on in his life anymore, and I don't care. Like that's just not the case. So I have personally gotten caught up in it, and I've seen a lot of people get caught up in sort of the ratios of like, well, I always reach out, so like I don't know about this friendship.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I think that's like one of the weakest signals you can look at, like one of the least useful things you can do. And I have other friends that are like super outgoing and proactive and just like, hey,
Yeah.
like come do this, come do that, and they're inviting everyone to everything. But that doesn't mean they're like a better friend than that guy that I didn't talk to for a couple years because for whatever reason we just didn't reach out to each other.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I think we covered this topic pretty well. Is there any final thoughts that you have about being a better friend?
Yeah, just like a couple high level points, which is
Yeah.
like it's so important to be able to make sort of space to have a two-way relationship because all the bad friends that I've seen are basically just like self-absorbed and completely only interested in their own stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay if that happens every once in a while, but if that's the norm, like
Right.
that's what's going on all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and communication doesn't work,
Mm-hmm.
and they never like proactively communicate,
Yeah.
it's those are just not worth having.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah. So keep the good people in your life, and if they feel like they're a drain, then maybe it's time to, you don't have to. The thing about friendship that I want to like leave as a final note is that you don't have to like maintain all your friendships, especially if you feel like it's all one-sided. And yeah, maybe it's not always, friendships can end just like romantic relationships can end, and that's okay sometimes. um but just keep that in mind. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in this week. We appreciate you. And if you appreciate us, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and help spread the happiness in the world. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.